Welcome to Ethical Point. I'm your mentor. Today we're diving into a fascinating explainer that tackles a massive ethical friction you're going to face in General Studies Paper 4. We're looking at the clash between the international arms trade and global peace.
Hey everyone, I'm the skeptic. I'll be asking the tough, real-world questions today because, we constantly see powerful nations preaching peace, but those exact same nations completely dominate the global arms sales that keep conflicts burning. So we're going to break down exactly how to structure, analyze, and write a top-tier mains answer on this specific dilemma. Let's get into it.
Let's run through our agenda real quick. First, the Eleanor Roosevelt dilemma, then ethics versus war economics. After that, strategic paths to peace, mastering the mains answer, and finally, future trends. We're going to transform all this dense geopolitical theory into a really high-scoring exam argument for you. All right, starting off with Section 1, the Eleanor Roosevelt dilemma, action over rhetoric. If you want to nail a question like that, 2024 UPSC 10-marker on powerful nations prolonging wars, you absolutely need a killer introduction. Take a look at this Eleanor Roosevelt quote. It completely demands a shift from just talking about peace to actually taking responsibility. Using this sets the tone perfectly. It shows the examiner you instantly grasp that massive gap between diplomatic talk and what actually happens on the ground. Yeah, the contrast is honestly pretty jarring. You've got this beautiful idealism and peace rhetoric on one side, but modern geopolitical reality on the other. Major global powers love to talk peace, but they heavily prioritize their military-industrial complex. They're exporting weapons, using proxy interventions, and throwing around geopolitical vetoes just to protect commercial interests. It's a friction we see all the time in ongoing global conflicts. Moving right into Section 2, ethics versus war economics, the core moral friction. Right at the center of your GS Paper 4 answer, you have to clearly articulate this conflict. Can commercial gains ever really justify human suffering? To do that, let's look at power asymmetry. In simple, everyday terms, it's the unequal dynamic where the big, powerful nations sell the weapons and weaker, developing nations actually pay the price. The devastation hits the global south, but the profits, they go straight to the global north.
Wow, yeah. Recognizing that imbalance is absolutely essential for any kind of ethical analysis here.
But, okay, let me play devil's advocate for a second. Can these exporting nations actually afford to just abandon defense manufacturing? I mean, millions of jobs rely entirely on this war-based economy.
That's a totally fair, pragmatic point. But the ethical alternative isn't just domestic economic collapse, right? It's shifting to a peace economy. Instead of relying on arms exports for revenue, a peace economy takes all that incredible technological power and redirects it toward things we actually need, like climate resilience, renewable energy, and global public health.
And when you make that shift, you unlock something called the peace dividend. Simply put, this is the massive, long-term economic bonus a society gets when it stops throwing money at war-making and instead invests those resources into global stability and development. It literally proves that being an architect of peace pays off way more in the long run than being a merchant of death. Okay, that makes sense. But if peace is the absolute ultimate goal, how do nations ever ethically justify using military force in the first place?
That brings us to just war theory. This is your absolute moral baseline for the exam. Basically, it's a framework that says military force can sometimes be justified, but only as a strictly proportionate, absolute last resort, and it must rigorously protect non-combatants and civilians. So if a nation's arms exports end up violating these rules, those sales are fundamentally unethical.
All right, theory is great and all, but here's my challenge. How do we actually measure the harm of these exports in the real world? Like, how do we force powerful nations to change their behavior and take diplomatic action? That is the million-dollar question, and it makes for a perfect way-forward section in your mains answer. You'd propose a conflict impact assessment. Here's a highly practical, step-by-step hypothetical framework to stop conflict profiteering. Step 1, an international body like the UN or WTO triggers the assessment. Step 2 involves checking a GDP export threshold. And Step 3, mandatory diplomatic action. Let's see how this actually looks. Okay. Seeing it visually helps a lot. So, if a nation's current export volume to a specific conflict zone shoots past an agreed-upon safe threshold, like that big red bar right there, alarms go off. Exceeding that economic limit legally forces the exporting nation to halt sales. They have to immediately prioritize mediation and back-channel talks over building up military infrastructure. Exactly. Let's move to Section 3, Strategic Paths to Peace, Interventions, and Global Accountability. So we've nailed down the moral problem. Now, what's the actionable policy? The biggest foundational shift has to be moving from exceptionalism to universalism. Exceptionalism is basically selective morality, loudly condemning a war when it disrupts your trade, but quietly fueling a proxy war somewhere else because it suits your national interests. Universalism, on the other hand, means applying human rights standards equally, everywhere. A human life in an expendable region has the exact same value as one anywhere else. To make that universalism a reality, we'd need some very clear, pragmatic policy interventions to clean up this opaque industry. First, we have to strengthen international treaties. Second, force governments to publish their arms deals and risk assessments. And third, institute strict parliamentary scrutiny. No more of these decisions being made completely in the shadows. Right on the money. We also need strict corporate accountability. In plain English, this means legally forcing global defense firms to track exactly how their weapons are being used. By mandating strict human rights due diligence across their entire supply chains, we can legally regulate these companies and prevent them from engaging in outright conflict profiteering. Skeptic, tracking with you 100%. So, if we summarize the role of international law here, treaties and end-user monitoring are basically the vital legal brakes of the whole system. They enforce the ethics of responsibility, legally ensuring that weapons simply do not end up in the hands of parties that routinely violate humanitarian norms. Let's jump to Section 4, Mastering the Mains Answer, Integrating Ethical Frameworks. All right, knowing all this theory is one thing, but condensing it into a crisp conclusion for a 10-marker under exam pressure, that's the real trick. Here's your blueprint. Lean on virtue ethics to argue that a moral nation has to immediately cease supplies if civilians are targeted. Use consequentialism to push for redirecting defense tech to public health. And use deontological ethics to highlight our absolute duty to respect universal human rights. A quick mnemonic for rapid revision in the exam hall, VCD. Value civilian dignity. Definitely write that down. Skeptic, VCD. I love that. Okay, Section 5, Future Trends and Exam Prep. The Trend Extrapolator. Let's use our Trend Extrapolator to predict what UPSC examiners might throw at you next year based on these sources. Here is practice prompt number 1. How can we overcome the global reliance on the defense economy to bring peace without causing domestic economic collapse? This perfectly tests your ability to realistically apply those peace economy and peace dividend concepts we talked about. And here's practice prompt number 2 to round things out. Critically evaluate the role of the UN and international treaties in curbing global arms exports. This one is going to heavily test your understanding of international institutions and how you'd apply those legal brakes we just discussed. Ultimately, as a future civil servant, you're going to spend your career constantly balancing realism with idealism. So here's a final provocative thought to chew on. Will you let economic interests justify moral complicity, or will you use ethical frameworks to champion the architecture of peace? Think deeply about that as you practice your answers. Thanks for hanging out with us for this explainer. Keep writing those mains answers, and we'll see you next time on Ethical Point.